I never thought I'd become the neighborhood vigilante over some cookies, but life has a funny way of pushing you to your limits. The smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies wafted through my apartment as I carefully arranged them on the cooling rack. Another batch perfectly executed. I'd spent years perfecting my grandmother's recipe, tweaking it until the cookies had just the right balance of chewiness and crunch. Baking had always been my escape, my way of bringing a little sweetness into the world. But lately, my baking ventures had been turning sour, literally disappearing before I could share them with their intended recipients. I stared at the empty spot on my kitchen counter where yesterday's batch had been placed to cool, while I stepped out for a quick errand. Gone. Again. I was beyond frustrated at this point, and I knew exactly who was behind it. If you're reading this, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below if you've ever dealt with someone stealing your hard work. Trust me, this story takes quite a turn you won't see coming. When I first moved into Oak Ridge Estates 6 months ago, I was charmed by the manicured lawns, the quiet cul-de-sacs, and the sense of community the realtor had promised. What she conveniently glossed over was the iron fist with which the Homeowners Association ruled over every aspect of our lives, from the height of our grass to the color of our mailboxes. And at the helm of this micromanaging ship was none other than Diane Patterson, or as most residents not so affectionately called her behind her back, Karen. Diane was in her mid-50s with an immaculately maintained blonde bob that seemed to defy the laws of physics, always perfectly in place regardless of weather conditions. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, which remained cold and calculating as she scanned the neighborhood for violations to report. She drove a white Mercedes SUV that she parked with mathematical precision in her driveway, and she wore a perpetual expression of mild disapproval, as if the entire world was a poorly organized closet that she'd been tasked with straightening. My troubles with Diane began innocently enough. I'd started a small side business selling my baked goods to local cafes, and occasionally I'd use the community garage, which was part of our HOA amenities, to store larger orders overnight when my apartment's air conditioning couldn't keep up during the summer heat. I had all the proper permits, followed food safety protocols to the letter, and always left the space spotless after use. But Diane seemed to take personal offense to my entrepreneurial efforts. "The community garage is not zoned for commercial activities," she'd declared during one of our first encounters, her voice dripping with condescension as she looked down her nose at my cooling racks of lemon bars. I had politely pointed out that the HOA regulations only prohibited manufacturing operations and retail businesses operating out of residential units, neither of which applied to my small-scale baking that occurred in my own kitchen. The permits were in order, and I was simply using the garage as temporary storage, well within my rights as a resident. Diane had narrowed her eyes at my response, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. "We'll see about that," she'd said ominously before marching away, her heels clicking sharply against the concrete. That conversation marked the beginning of what could only be described as a cold war between us. Diane began scrutinizing everything I did, from the length of time my garbage bins remained at the curb after collection to the placement of my welcome mat. The notices started appearing on my door, warnings about vague infractions that seemed to apply only to me and not to the other residents who committed the same offenses. I tried to maintain the peace, always responding with a smile and addressing her concerns promptly, but nothing seemed to satisfy her. There was something almost personal about her vendetta against me, though I couldn't figure out what I'd done to earn such focused animosity. I asked my neighbor Frank, an elderly gentleman who'd lived in Oak Ridge since its inception, if he knew why Diane might have it out for me. He just chuckled and shook his head. "Don't take it personally, dear," he advised. "Diane needs someone to target. Before you it was the Hendersons with their excessive holiday decorations. Before them it was Mrs. Abernathy and her bird feeders that were supposedly attracting vermin. Diane can't feel important unless she's making someone else feel small." And then the disappearances began. At first it was just a few cookies from a cooling batch. I'd assumed I'd miscounted or eaten more than I remembered. But then entire trays began vanishing when I stepped away for just a few minutes. It was frustrating not only because of the lost product, but because those were orders I needed to fulfill. Clients were waiting and I was building a reputation I couldn't afford to damage. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. I even set up reminder alerts on my phone to track exactly how many cookies I'd made and where I'd left them. The results were indisputable. Cookies were disappearing, and not due to any lapse in my memory. I began to suspect someone was taking them, but the idea seemed so petty, so childish, that I initially dismissed it. Who would steal cookies? They were just cookies. Delicious ones, certainly, but hardly worth the risk of getting caught in what amounted to theft. The breaking point came when an entire order for a child's birthday party disappeared. 24 elaborately decorated sugar cookies that had taken me hours to complete. I'd left them in the community garage to cool while I ran to the store for packaging materials, and when I returned 30 minutes later, every last cookie was gone. I was devastated and embarrassed. I had to call the client and explain the situation, offering a refund and profuse apologies. The client was understanding, but decided to go with another baker for future events. I lost not only the money from that order, but potentially future business as well. That night, I sat in my apartment, nursing a glass of wine and fighting back tears of frustration. This wasn't just about cookies anymore. It was about my livelihood, my passion, my future. Someone was deliberately sabotaging me, and I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who that someone was. The question was, how could I prove it? And more importantly, how could I stop it? Something had to be done. It was time to catch the cookie thief red-handed. My friend Lana from 2 doors down had been sympathetic to my plight from the start. She'd had her own run-ins with Diane over her garden gnome collection. Apparently they were tacky ornaments not befitting the aesthetic standards of Oak Ridge Estates. When I told her about my plan to set up a surveillance camera, she was immediately on board. "I've got an old nanny cam shaped like a potted plant," she offered, her eyes gleaming with mischief. "It's motion-activated and connects to an app on your phone. You'll know the second someone touches those cookies." I gratefully accepted her offer, and we set up our sting operation the following weekend. Lana had worked in marketing before transitioning to freelance graphic design, and she approached our little espionage mission with strategic thinking. "We need to establish a pattern," she explained as we positioned the camera. One incident could be dismissed as a misunderstanding, but multiple instances of the same behavior? That's harder to explain away. I prepared a fresh batch of my signature chocolate chip cookies, the ones that had won me first place at the county fair 3 years running, and arranged them temptingly on a cooling rack in the community garage. The camera was positioned to have a clear view of the entire area, disguised among several actual plants I'd brought in to enhance the workspace. I even added a small sign that read, "Cooling, please do not disturb," to make it absolutely clear that these cookies were not up for grabs. With the trap set, I pretended to leave, making a show of checking my watch and rushing out as if late for an appointment. In reality, I went to Lana's apartment where we huddled around her iPad, watching the live feed from the camera. Her apartment was cozy and eclectic, filled with colorful throw pillows and an impressive collection of vintage movie posters that spoke to her artistic sensibilities. We settled onto her plush sofa, a bowl of popcorn between us, feeling like protagonists in our own amateur detective film. For nearly 40 minutes, nothing happened. The garage remained still and quiet, the cookies cooling undisturbed on their rack. I was beginning to think that maybe I'd been wrong. Perhaps neighborhood kids were sneaking in and taking the cookies, or maybe I really had been miscounting. Lana kept reassuring me to be patient. "If Diane's our culprit, she'll be methodical. She'll wait until she thinks the coast is clear," she said, reaching for another handful of popcorn. We made small talk to pass the time. Just as our conversation drifted to her upcoming blind date, the garage door opened on the screen. We both fell silent, our attention snapping back to the iPad. Diane Patterson entered, looking furtively over her shoulder before stepping fully into the space. She was dressed in her usual pristine attire, pressed slacks and a button-up blouse that screamed, "I demand to speak to your manager." Her movements were deliberate and practiced, suggesting this wasn't her first cookie heist. "I knew it," Lana whispered fiercely beside me, her eyes wide with vindication. "That hypocritical witch!" We watched in stunned silence as Diane produced a large container from her oversized handbag and began transferring my cookies into it, not just one or two, but the entire batch. She worked quickly, efficiently, as if she'd done this many times before, which, I realized with growing anger, she probably had. "She's not even tasting them," I observed through gritted teeth. "She's taking them all." This wasn't petty theft motivated by an irresistible sweet tooth. This was deliberate sabotage. The realization sent a cold surge of fury through me. What kind of person goes out of their way to undermine someone else's small business? What possible satisfaction could she derive from it? Diane closed her container with a satisfied smile and left the garage as stealthily as she'd entered, leaving behind an empty cooling rack and an incriminating video that made my blood boil. The evidence was clear, but what to do with it? My first impulse was to confront Diane directly, to storm over to her perfectly maintained colonial and demand an explanation. I imagined the scene, me standing on her pristine porch, iPad in hand, playing the damning footage while she stammered excuses. The fantasy was satisfying but ultimately impractical. Diane had established herself as the neighborhood authority long before I arrived. A direct confrontation would likely backfire spectacularly. But Lana, ever the voice of reason, suggested a more calculated approach. "She's been tormenting you for months," she pointed out as we reviewed the footage again. "A simple confrontation won't change anything. She'll deny it, or worse, find some way to turn it against you. We need to be smarter than that." She was right, of course. Diane had been playing this game much longer than I had, and she held considerable influence within the HOA. A direct confrontation would likely backfire, possibly resulting in even more scrutiny and harassment. No, we needed a plan that would not only catch her in the act, but would make it impossible for her to wriggle out of the consequences. And that's when the idea struck me. A plan so perfect in its simplicity that I couldn't believe I hadn't thought of it sooner. "What if," I said slowly, a smile spreading across my face, "the next batch of cookies had a special ingredient, something that wouldn't harm her but would make her regret ever stealing from me?" Lana's eyes lit up with understanding. "Wasabi," she breathed, the word hanging in the air between us like a promise of sweet retribution. "My brother once ate a wasabi-filled donut on a dare, said it felt like his sinuses were being power-washed from the inside out." We spent the rest of the evening refining our plan. The execution had to be perfect. I would make another batch of my chocolate chip cookies, but this time, half of them would contain a wasabi cream filling, enough to deliver a shocking burst of heat, but not enough to cause any real harm. The wasabi cookies would be indistinguishable from the regular ones until bitten into. To achieve this, I would need to bake the cookies slightly thicker than usual, then carefully cut them in half horizontally, spread the wasabi mixture, and reassemble them. The wasabi filling would be a mixture of the green paste diluted with cream cheese to make it spreadable, but still pack a potent punch. The regular cookies would be positioned at the front of the tray, with the wasabi-filled ones arranged behind them. This way, if anyone innocent happened to take just one cookie to sample, they'd get a normal one. But if someone were to take the entire batch, as Diane had been doing, they'd end up with a mouthful of unexpected fire. It was a perfect plan, harmless but effective, providing irrefutable proof of Diane's theft while delivering a memorable lesson about taking what doesn't belong to you. As we ironed out the details, I felt a twinge of doubt. Was this too petty? Was I stooping to Diane's level by engaging in this kind of subterfuge? But then I remembered the lost birthday order, the client who wouldn't be returning, the hours of work wasted because of one person's spite. No, this wasn't petty. This was justice. Sweet, spicy justice. The next day was a Saturday, which was perfect for our plan. The community garage was busiest on weekends, with residents coming and going for various activities. This provided both cover for our operation and potential witnesses for whatever fallout might occur. I spent the morning baking, carefully injecting wasabi paste mixed with a bit of cream cheese into half the batch of cookies. The process was delicate and time-consuming, requiring precision to ensure the filling remained hidden until the fateful first bite. As I worked, I couldn't help but wonder about Diane's motivation. What had made her target me so specifically? Was it just because I had stood up to her that first time, citing the HOA rules back to her? Or was there something deeper, something more personal, driving her vendetta? I pushed these questions aside, focusing on the task at hand. The filling was hidden completely once the cookies were assembled, with no visible difference between the regular and special ones. I arranged them on the cooling rack as before, making sure the regular cookies were prominently displayed at the front. The nanny cam was repositioned for optimal coverage, and I once again made a show of leaving in a hurry. This time, I didn't go to Lana's apartment. Instead, I waited in my car at the far end of the parking lot, where I had a clear view of the garage entrance while remaining inconspicuous. My heart pounded with anticipation, a mix of nervousness and excitement making my palms sweaty against the steering wheel. What if she didn't take the bait today? What if someone else took the cookies instead? What if the wasabi wasn't strong enough to make an impact? These doubts swirled in my mind as I kept watch, occasionally checking my phone for updates from Lana, who was monitoring the live feed from her apartment. The waiting was the hardest part, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours as I sat there, alternating between staring at the garage door and checking my rearview mirror to make sure no one noticed my suspicious loitering. The wait was shorter this time. Less than 20 minutes after I'd left, my phone buzzed with a text from Lana. "Eagle has landed. Operation Wasabi is a go." I watched from my vantage point as Diane entered the garage, staying just long enough to make her theft, and then exited with her usual large handbag, now undoubtedly filled with my cookies. She walked briskly toward her house, which was situated on what residents referred to as HOA Row, the string of houses where most of the association board members lived. These properties had the best views of the community gardens and were set slightly apart from the rest of the development, subtly reinforcing the social hierarchy that Diane so zealously maintained. I started my car and drove slowly around the block, parking near the community center, which gave me a partial view of Diane's backyard. And then I waited. The anticipation was almost unbearable, my imagination running wild with scenarios of what might happen next. Would she eat the cookies immediately? Would she save them for later? Would she share them with someone else? The thought of multiple people experiencing the wasabi surprise simultaneously was both alarming and darkly amusing. I didn't have to wait long for the results of our little experiment. The scream that pierced the quiet Saturday afternoon was so sudden and so piercing that I actually jumped in my seat. It came from the direction of Diane's house, a shriek of shock and outrage followed by what sounded like choking or sputtering. The sound cut through the peaceful neighborhood ambiance like a siren, causing birds to scatter from nearby trees and several neighbors to peer curiously out of their windows. I remained in my car, my heart racing as I witnessed the consequences of my culinary revenge unfolding in real time. Several neighbors emerged from their homes, looking around in confusion for the source of the disturbance. I remained in my car, fighting to keep a straight face as I watched Diane burst onto her back patio, fanning her mouth frantically and gulping from a garden hose. Her perfectly coiffed hair was now in disarray, her face an alarming shade of red. She continued to make distressed noises, drawing even more attention from the neighbors. Mr. Johnson from across the street approached her with concern, asking if she needed medical assistance. Diane waved him away vehemently, still unable to form coherent sentences as she alternated between gulping water and fanning her burning mouth. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Phase 1 of the plan had been executed flawlessly. Diane had taken the bait, quite literally, and was now suffering the fiery consequences of her thievery. The wasabi had clearly delivered the intended impact, strong enough to cause significant discomfort but not dangerous in any way. It was a proportional response to months of harassment and sabotage, a spicy reminder that actions have consequences. But this was just the beginning. The wasabi cookies were meant to deliver a message, to let her know that her actions had been discovered. What came next would depend on her response. Would she recognize that she'd been caught and back off? Or would she escalate the situation? Given what I knew about Diane Patterson, I suspected it would be the latter, and I was prepared for that. The video evidence was safely backed up in multiple locations, ready to be deployed if necessary. For now, though, I was content to drive home, replaying the image of Diane's distress in my mind and feeling a sense of justice, however small. Back at my apartment, I called Lana to share the details of Diane's reaction, which she'd been unable to witness from her vantage point. We laughed together at the image of the usually composed HOA president frantically drinking from a garden hose. "Do you think she'll figure out it was deliberate?" Lana asked after our laughter had subsided. "She's not stupid," I replied. "She'll know someone set her up. The question is whether she'll connect it to her cookie theft or think it was just bad luck." Lana hummed thoughtfully. "Either way, I bet we'll hear about it soon enough. Diane's not one to suffer in silence." She was right about that. Diane had built her reputation on vocal objections and public proclamations of wrongdoing. If she felt she'd been targeted, she would make it known, loudly and to anyone who would listen. We agreed to maintain our normal routines in the coming days, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. The fallout from the Wasabi incident, as Lana had gleefully dubbed it, came swiftly. By Sunday evening, I'd received an official notice from the HOA informing me that an emergency meeting had been called for Wednesday night to address serious concerns regarding food safety and proper use of community facilities. The notice was signed by Diane in her capacity as HOA president, her signature an aggressive scrawl that seemed to convey her fury even through paper. The letter was filled with official-sounding jargon about potential contamination, hazardous food handling, and endangerment of community members. But the message was clear. Diane was out for blood. My blood, specifically. I showed the notice to Lana, who read it with raised eyebrows. "She's trying to get ahead of the situation," Lana observed, tapping her finger against the HOA letterhead. "Classic move. She knows she's in the wrong, so she's going on the offensive. Make you look like the bad guy before you can expose her." I nodded in agreement. It was exactly what I'd expected. Diane was too proud and too invested in her position of authority to admit wrongdoing. Instead, she was attempting to use the very system she controlled to punish me for daring to outsmart her. The days leading up to the meeting were tense. I noticed Diane watching me from her window whenever I left my apartment, her gaze cold and calculating. Twice I found additional HOA notices on my door citing dubious violations, once for improper disposal of organic waste. I'd composted some coffee grounds in the community garden, which was explicitly permitted, and another for unauthorized modifications to common areas. I'd moved a chair in the lobby to reach a high shelf and apparently failed to return it to its exact original position. These petty harassments only strengthened my resolve. If Diane thought she could intimidate me into submission, she was sorely mistaken. I spent the time preparing for the meeting, gathering my evidence and rehearsing what I would say. Lana helped me edit the video footage from the nanny cam, creating a concise but damning compilation that clearly showed Diane's repeated thefts. We also printed the relevant sections of the HOA bylaws that pertain to both personal property rights and the permitted uses of the community garage, highlighting the areas that supported my position. I also sought advice from Walter Green, a retired judge who lived in the building adjacent to mine. Walter was one of the original homeowners at Oak Ridge Estates and had watched the HOA evolve over the years from a simple community organization to the bureaucratic machine it had become under Diane's leadership. When I explained the situation to him, including my wasabi retaliation, which I admitted with some embarrassment, he chuckled appreciatively. "Diane has been running this place like her personal fiefdom for too long," he confided. "It's about time someone stood up to her." He advised me on how to present my case effectively at the meeting, emphasizing the importance of remaining calm and factual. "Let her get worked up," he counseled. "The more agitated she becomes, the more reasonable you'll appear by contrast." It was sound advice, and I was grateful for his support. Wednesday evening arrived, and the community center meeting room was packed. Word had spread about the emergency meeting, and residents were curious about what could be so urgent. The room buzzed with speculative conversations, with some people wondering aloud if there had been a break-in or some other security concern. I arrived early, taking a seat near the front where I would have a clear view of Diane's face. Lana sat beside me, her tablet ready with our evidence. She squeezed my hand reassuringly as we waited, both of us maintaining composed expressions despite the nervous energy that thrummed between us. This was it, the culmination of months of harassment and weeks of careful planning. Whatever happened tonight would determine whether I could continue building my business in peace or would have to consider more drastic measures, like moving to a new community altogether. Diane entered the room with her usual air of authority, flanked by two other board members who always seemed to vote her way. She was impeccably dressed in a navy pantsuit, her composure fully restored after the Wasabi debacle. If I hadn't witnessed her meltdown with my own eyes, I would never have believed this collected woman had been frantically drinking from a garden hose just days ago. Her eyes flickered briefly in my direction, a flash of cold hatred quickly masked by a professional smile as she greeted various residents. She called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel, her voice crisp and commanding as she addressed the assembled residents. The room fell silent immediately, a testament to the control she exercised over the community. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Diane began, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on me with barely concealed hostility. "It has come to the board's attention that there have been concerning activities taking place in our community garage, activities that pose potential health risks and violate several HOA covenants." She went on to describe how a resident, she didn't name me directly, but her pointed glances made it clear who she meant, had been using the garage for unauthorized food preparation, and had recently left out items containing dangerous, unmarked ingredients that could cause severe allergic reactions. There were murmurs of concern from some of the older residents who exchanged worried glances. Diane was playing to her audience masterfully, framing me as a reckless, rule-breaking menace to community safety. She described the Wasabi incident in vague terms, presenting herself as a concerned citizen who had discovered potentially dangerous food items rather than as someone who had stolen them. According to her carefully crafted narrative, she had immediately disposed of the contaminated items and convened this meeting out of concern for community safety. Furthermore, she continued, gaining momentum, this resident has repeatedly ignored warnings about proper use of community facilities and has demonstrated a pattern of disregard for HOA regulations. She produced a folder containing copies of all the notices she'd issued me over the past months, holding them up for everyone to see. The stack looked impressively thick from a distance, though I knew many of those notices were for the same minor infractions, reissued after I'd already addressed them. In light of these ongoing violations, the board recommends a fine of $500 and a 3-month suspension of garage privileges. More murmurs, this time with mixed reactions. Some residents nodded in agreement while others looked skeptical of such harsh penalties. I noticed Walter Green frowning thoughtfully, his eyes moving between Diane and me as if assessing a complicated legal case. Diane smiled thinly, clearly believing she had the upper hand. "Now, before we vote on this recommendation, does anyone have anything to add to the discussion?" Her tone suggested she expected and would quickly dismiss any objections. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I raised my hand confidently, and Diane's smile faltered slightly as she acknowledged me with a curt nod. I stood up, feeling surprisingly calm despite the tension in the room. "Thank you, Ms. Patterson, for bringing these concerns to everyone's attention," I began, my voice steady and measured, just as Walter had advised. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about what's been happening in the garage, and I'd like to clarify a few points, if I may." Diane's eyes narrowed, but she gestured for me to continue, clearly expecting me to offer excuses or denials that she could then shoot down. Instead, I turned to Lana, who handed me her tablet. With the board's permission, I'd like to share some footage from the community garage that I think will help clarify the situation. Before Diane could object, I connected the tablet to the projector that was set up for HOA presentations and hit play on our carefully edited video. The room fell silent as the footage began to play on the large screen at the front of the room, all eyes drawn to the damning evidence unfolding before them. The video was crystal clear in its narrative. It showed Diane entering the garage on 5 separate occasions over the past 2 weeks, each time systematically taking entire batches of cookies that I had left cooling. The timestamps were clearly visible in each clip, as was Diane's face as she transferred the baked goods into her container. There was no room for misinterpretation or denial. The footage captured her deliberate actions from multiple angles, leaving no doubt about what she was doing. The final clip showed her reaction to the Wasabi cookies, her initial casual theft followed by her dramatic reaction upon tasting them. Several residents gasped audibly as the footage played. Others exchanged shocked glances, the implications of what they were seeing registering on their faces. Diane herself seemed frozen in place, her face growing increasingly pale as her repeated thefts were displayed for all to see. When the video ended, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room erupted in voices, some angry, others confused, all demanding explanations. I raised my voice to be heard above the commotion. As you can see, I have indeed been using the garage occasionally for temporary storage of baked goods, which is permitted under Section 7.3 of our HOA agreement for temporary storage of personal items. What is not permitted, however, is theft of personal property, which is clearly what's been happening here. I turned to face Diane directly, meeting her gaze without flinching. Menace and Patterson, you've been systematically stealing my baked goods, items that I prepare for my small business, which I operate in full compliance with county regulations and HOA rules. The dangerous ingredients you mentioned were simply wasabi paste, a common food item that I added to some cookies as a way to identify the thief who had been targeting my products. My voice remained calm and factual, without accusation or emotion, which made the evidence all the more damning. Diane finally found her voice, though it was noticeably less commanding than before. This is ridiculous. That video has clearly been doctored. I never took anything from the garage. But her denial rang hollow in the face of such clear evidence, and the muttering from the crowd suggested no one believed her. One of the other board members, Walter, cleared his throat uncomfortably. Diane, that footage looks pretty conclusive to me, and it would explain that incident we all heard on Saturday. Several residents nodded in agreement, recalling Diane's very public meltdown with the garden hose. Diane's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She turned to glare at me, her eyes burning with hatred. This is a violation of privacy. Recording in common areas without consent is against HOA rules. Walter shook his head, his expression grave but fair. Actually, our bylaws permit security recordings in common areas for the purpose of protecting property. There are signs posted to that effect at all entrances. He turned to address the room. I think we need to reconsider the matter at hand. It appears that rather than Ms. Wilson violating HOA rules, she has been the victim of ongoing theft that has damaged her business. The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. Residents who had initially been suspicious of me were now looking at Diane with disapproval. Some were openly discussing other instances where they'd felt unfairly targeted by her enforcement of HOA rules. Mr. Johnson mentioned how she'd fined him for planting roses of an unapproved variety in his private garden. The Thompsons recounted their bitter dispute over holiday decorations that Diane had deemed excessive, despite being more modest than those displayed by her allies on the board. The Wilson family described how their request to install a small ramp for their aging mother had been repeatedly denied on aesthetic grounds. The community's long-simmering discontent with Diane's leadership was finally bubbling to the surface, catalyzed by the irrefutable evidence of her hypocrisy. Diane made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "This is all a misunderstanding," she insisted, her voice taking on a pleading quality that sounded strange coming from someone usually so authoritative. I was simply removing items that had been left unattended, which is my duty as HOA president to maintain the cleanliness and order of our facilities. This explanation was met with skeptical silence. Everyone had seen her carefully packing away entire batches of cookies, not disposing of them as abandoned items. The contraband had been stored in her personal container, taken to her home and presumably consumed, until the Wasabi batch had delivered its fiery verdict. Walter exchanged glances with the third board member, Patricia, who had been notably quiet throughout the proceedings. Patricia gave a slight nod and Walter cleared his throat again. I move that we table the original agenda item regarding fines against Ms. Wilson and instead open a discussion about proper conduct for HOA board members. Patricia seconded the motion, her voice soft but determined. I agree. I think we need to revisit our governance structure and ensure that our leadership is acting in the best interests of all residents. Diane looked betrayed by this defection from her usual allies, her composure cracking further as she realized she was losing control of the narrative and possibly her position of authority. You can't do this, she protested, her voice rising. There are procedures, protocols. Walter interrupted her gently but firmly. Yes, there are procedures, Diane, and they include provisions for addressing misconduct by board members. I believe we should follow those procedures now. He turned to the room. All in favor of discussing board conduct instead of the originally proposed fines? A forest of hands rose immediately, the vote overwhelmingly in favor of Walter's motion. Diane's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the table, watching her carefully constructed authority crumble before her eyes. The meeting that followed was one of the most animated in Oak Ridge Estate's history, according to longtime residents. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their experiences with Diane's overzealous enforcement of rules that she herself apparently felt free to ignore when it suited her. The story of Gerald's garden gnomes came up repeatedly, as did Miranda's unapproved wind chimes and the bitter dispute over the Thompsons' holiday decorations that had apparently been excessive, according to standards that seemed to apply only to those who had disagreed with Diane in the past. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a comprehensive picture of a leader who had abused her position to settle personal scores and enforce arbitrary standards. As the testimonies continued, Diane grew increasingly agitated, interrupting speakers and attempting to defend her actions. But each interruption only served to further demonstrate the autocratic behavior that had so alienated her neighbors. Her face grew redder with each accusation, her carefully maintained composure unraveling thread by thread as years of resentment were finally voiced openly. Mrs. Abernathy recounted how Diane had threatened to fine her for excessive bird activity when she installed feeders to enjoy watching cardinals from her patio. The Rodriguez family described how their application to install energy-efficient windows had been delayed for months on arbitrary aesthetic concerns, while a similar application from Diane's friend had been approved in less than a week. With each story, it became increasingly clear that Diane's reign had been characterized by favoritism, pettiness, and an abuse of power that had affected nearly every household in the community. Finally, Walter called for order and proposed an immediate vote of no confidence in Diane's leadership. In light of the evidence presented tonight and the testimonies we've heard, I believe it is in the best interest of our community to make a change in leadership, he stated. I move that we hold an immediate vote of no confidence in Diane Patterson's presidency, with the understanding that if the motion passes, she will be removed from her position, effective immediately. Patricia seconded the motion, adding, and I further move that we schedule an election for new board officers at next month's regular meeting with Walters serving as interim president until that time. The room hummed with tension as residents exchanged glances. Diane stood frozen behind the table, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge, her face a mask of disbelief. You can't do this, she whispered, but there was no conviction behind her words. She knew the HOA bylaws permitted exactly this kind of action in cases of misconduct. Walter announced the results. A palpable sense of relief swept through the room, as if a weight had been lifted from the collective shoulders of the community. There was no cheering or celebration. That would have been undignified and perhaps unkind, but there were smiles and nods of satisfaction among many of the residents who had suffered under Diane's regime. Walter, as vice president, would temporarily assume leadership duties until a proper election could be held the following month. He promised a review of all outstanding fines and warnings, as well as a community workshop to simplify and clarify the HOA regulations so that they serve the community rather than burden it. Diane sat in stunned silence as the results were announced, the color draining from her face as the reality of her fall from power sank in. Her perfectly maintained facade cracked completely, revealing a vulnerability that made her suddenly seem smaller, more human. For a brief moment I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered the months of harassment, the lost business, the stress she had inflicted not just on me but on so many others, and my sympathy faded. When Walter asked her to turn over her HOA materials, the official record book, the key to the HOA office, and the ceremonial gavel, she did so with trembling hands, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. Without another word, she gathered her personal belongings and left the meeting, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The slam of the community center door behind her seemed to mark the end of an era in our neighborhood. After the meeting, several residents approached me to express their support and share their own stories of run-ins with Diane. Many apologized for not speaking up sooner, admitting they had been intimidated by her authority and afraid of becoming her next target. "You were brave to stand up to her," Mrs. Abernathy told me, patting my hand affectionately. "The rest of us just grumbled, but never had the courage to challenge her directly." I assured her that my actions hadn't been particularly brave, just a necessary response to a situation that was affecting my livelihood. But her words stayed with me, making me realize that the Wasabi revenge had accomplished something much larger than I had intended. It hadn't just protected my business, it had liberated an entire community from a petty tyrant. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Oak Ridge Estates. Walter, as interim president, immediately established a committee to review and simplify the HOA regulations, focusing on maintaining property values without micromanaging residents' lives. The atmosphere in the neighborhood lightened noticeably as people began to feel they could enjoy their homes without fear of arbitrary penalties. Gerald's garden gnome collection reappeared on his lawn. Miranda hung her wind chimes, their gentle tinkling adding a pleasant soundtrack to afternoon walks through the community. The Thompson family installed their long-desired wheelchair ramp for their mother. Small personal expressions that had been suppressed under Diane's regime began to emerge across the neighborhood. Colorful mailboxes, creative garden arrangements, unique door decorations, each one a tiny celebration of individuality within our shared community space. As for Diane, she became something of a recluse, rarely emerging from her house except for essential errands. When neighbors did spot her, they reported that she avoided eye contact and hurried by without speaking. Her pristine lawn began to show signs of neglect, not enough to violate any regulations, but enough to indicate that her heart was no longer in the meticulous maintenance that had once been her hallmark. Her white Mercedes remained in the driveway, unwashed, accumulating pollen and dust in a way that the old Diane would never have tolerated. Some felt sorry for her isolation, but others, particularly those who had suffered most under her reign, considered it a fitting consequence for her actions. I found myself somewhere in the middle, satisfied that justice had been served but not taking any pleasure in her evident unhappiness. There was something almost tragic about her fall, a cautionary tale about the emptiness of power built on intimidation rather than respect. My own situation improved dramatically. With Diane's harassment ended, I was able to focus on growing my baking business. Walter and the new board even approved my request to use a small, unused storage room in the community center as a proper cooling area for my larger orders, provided I maintained appropriate insurance and cleanliness standards. It was a reasonable compromise that benefited everyone. I gained a dedicated space for my business, and the HOA received a modest rental fee that went toward community improvements. The room had once been meant for community craft supplies, but had sat empty for years after Diane deemed such activities messy and disruptive. Now it served a practical purpose, supporting a small business while generating funds for neighborhood projects. My cookies became something of a local legend after the story of the Wasabi revenge spread through the neighborhood. Orders increased as people became curious about the treats that had brought down the notorious HOA tyrant. "Are these the famous cookies that got Diane?" customers would ask with a wink when I delivered orders to local cafes. The incident had given me an unexpected marketing boost, turning what had been a struggling side business into a thriving local brand. I was now baking nearly every day to keep up with demand, experimenting with new flavors that quickly gained popularity beyond Oak Ridge estates. What had started as a hobby was evolving into a full-fledged career prospect, all thanks to Diane's theft and my spicy retaliation. Lana and I became even closer friends through our shared adventure. Her marketing background proved invaluable as she helped me rebrand my business, now called Sweet Justice Bakery, a name that never failed to make us laugh but resonated with customers who appreciated the story behind it. We even developed a special Wasabi surprise cookie that became our signature item, a sweet cookie with a small kick of wasabi that was actually quite delicious when expected. It became our best seller, particularly popular at office parties where coworkers would dare each other to try them. We made sure the wasabi cookies were clearly labeled and contained just enough of the green paste to provide an interesting flavor contrast without overwhelming the palate. Life had taken an unexpected turn, transforming what had started as a frustrating problem into an opportunity for growth and community connection. I no longer saw Oak Ridge Estates as a place of restriction and conflict, but as a home where I could build something meaningful. The new HOA leadership organized more community events, potlucks, garden shows, holiday celebrations that brought residents together in ways that hadn't happened under Diane's administration. I contributed baked goods to these gatherings, using them as opportunities to test new recipes and connect with neighbors who might not otherwise have discovered my business. The community that had once felt fragmented was knitting itself back together, finding common ground in shared spaces and experiences. About 6 months after the Wasabi incident, I was packing up after providing cookies for a neighborhood block party when I noticed Diane standing at the edge of the gathering, watching the festivities with an expression I couldn't quite read. She looked different. Her hair was longer and less rigidly styled, her clothing more casual than the formal attire she'd always favored as HOA president. But the most striking change was in her demeanor. The imperious confidence that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something more subdued, more hesitant. I hadn't spoken to her since the night of the emergency meeting, and neither had most of the residents. She had become a ghost in our community, present but not participating, existing on the periphery of the vibrant social life that had blossomed in her absence. On impulse, I picked up a small box of assorted cookies, regular ones, no wasabi, and approached her. "We all make mistakes," I replied, not unkindly. "The important thing is what we learn from them." Diane nodded, examining the box of cookies thoughtfully. For what it's worth, they were always delicious. Even the wasabi ones had a certain memorable quality. We both chuckled at that, the tension between us easing slightly. Diane glanced toward the party where neighbors were chatting and laughing together. "The neighborhood seems different now," she observed. "Happier." I followed her gaze, noting the relaxed atmosphere that had developed in the months since the HOA's reformation. "It turns out people take better care of a community when they feel like they're part of it, not just subject to its rules," I suggested. Diane considered this, then nodded slowly. "I'm beginning to see that now." There was a vulnerability in her admission that I hadn't expected. My husband was on the board when we first moved here. After he died, taking his place felt like honoring him somehow. But somewhere along the way I lost sight of what he valued about this community. It wasn't perfect lawns or matching mailboxes. It was this. She gestured toward the residents mingling freely, the atmosphere of relaxed enjoyment that pervaded the gathering. Our conversation was brief, and I wouldn't say we became friends afterward. Some bridges once burned can't be fully rebuilt, but there was a noticeable shift in our interactions. Diane began to emerge from her self-imposed isolation, gradually rejoining community activities not as a leader but as a regular resident. She even volunteered to help with the neighborhood garden, working quietly alongside people who had once feared her clipboard and frown. It was a small step toward redemption, but a meaningful one. At the next HOA election, she attended but didn't run for any position, instead voicing support for Walter's continued leadership. She still lived in her perfectly maintained colonial, but the rigid perfection had softened somewhat. She planted wildflowers in one corner of her yard, a small, colorful rebellion against her own former standards. As for me, Sweet Justice Bakery continued to thrive, eventually growing to the point where I could open a small storefront in the nearby shopping center. The grand opening was a community event, with residents from Oak Ridge Estates showing up in force to support what many now considered our neighborhood bakery. Walter cut the ribbon, and Lana, who had become my business partner, gave a speech about how adversity can sometimes lead to unexpected opportunity. We offered free samples of all our bestsellers, including the Wasabi Surprise, which had gained a cult following. To my surprise, Diane attended the opening, quietly congratulating me on my success before purchasing a box of assorted cookies. I still lived in Oak Ridge Estates, finding unexpected contentment in the community that had initially caused me so much stress. The storage room in the community center remained our production kitchen for large orders, and I taught occasional baking classes there for interested residents. Looking back at the whole cookie saga now, I can't help but marvel at how something as simple as baked goods became the catalyst for such significant change. It's a reminder that sometimes justice is served not through grand confrontations but through small, well-timed acts of resistance. And occasionally, that justice might come with a side of wasabi. The story of Diane and the wasabi cookies has become something of a legend in our community, retold at gatherings with varying degrees of embellishment. In some versions, Diane runs screaming down the street with smoke coming out of her ears. In others, she immediately confesses her theft to the entire neighborhood. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. Less dramatic than the legends, but more meaningful in its long-term impact. A community found its voice, a tyrant found humility, and I found an unexpected path to success, all because someone couldn't resist taking cookies that didn't belong to them. So if you ever find yourself facing your own neighborhood Karen, remember, creativity, evidence, and a bit of strategic spice might just be the perfect recipe for sweet, sweet justice. Oh, and if you're ever in the area, stop by Sweet Justice Bakery. We've got a special wasabi surprise cookie with your name on it, but don't worry, we'll warn you before you take a bite. Unless, of course, you've been stealing cookies from your neighbors. In that case, all bets are off. Life has a way of balancing its accounts, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. In my case, it was through a lesson delivered not with a stick, but with a cookie. Proof that justice can indeed be sweet, even when it comes with a kick.